Welcome to the SOAS Dev Track podcast series. The Dev Track podcast series offers episodes covering critical conversations in international development with academics, researchers, and practitioners. This episode will cover the findings from the recent report titled World Development Challenges – Development Progress from a Wider Lens, which was produced by the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for West Asia, often referred to as UN-ESCWA. The report was launched in October during an event hosted by CDPR. CDPR was the former name of SOAS DevTrack. The report proposes a new lens for measuring development in the form of a Development Challenges Index, which aims to capture the complex challenges facing developed and developing countries. Here to discuss this further is Carlos Oya, Professor of Political Economy of Development at SOAS, and lead author of the report, Khalid Abu Ismail, who is a senior economist at the UN-ESCWA, where he leads projects on poverty, inequality, and human development.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here in this interview, sharing this conversation with Khalid on a very important report. Important not only because of the key findings that have been presented here, but also because it introduces a new index, a new multidimensional development challenges index, which is going to generate plenty of debate. We do know that indices have been created in the past, particularly multidimensional indices of welfare. UN institutions have been very active in playing this role and shaping the ground for debates about measurement of development. What's interesting about this particular project and this report is that it comes from a regional UN agency, UNESCO, and not from central agency like UNDP, which was at the forefront of previous efforts at producing such indices, notably the Human Development Index. So my question really is about the background to this story. How come such an important and global-oriented report and index didn't come from a central agency? What was the history behind the production of this report and particularly the work towards the index? And what does it tell us about such efforts within the UN?
Thank you, Carlos. It's a pleasure to speak to you, and certainly the questions that you ask are very pertinent. Let me start with the one related to why is it that the Regional Commission is undertaking this task. Let me put forward two answers to that question. The first one is because we need this perspective. So as a regional commission, we are tasked with assessing development challenges at the regional level and also helping countries in assessing their own development challenges. The tools that we have as economists, usually we do tend to rely on global indices like the Human Development Index, Multidimensional Poverty Index, Global Poverty, what used to be the $1.09, now is a $2.15 a day line, or other indices. And when we deploy these tools, we find that they have major limitations, particularly with regards to Arab states. So the main limitation is because many of these tools were designed to capture basic achievements in health, education, income, or extreme deprivation. So if you are looking at the challenges from a region that is mainly middle income, or you're more interested in a broader narrative, as we said, that captures not only extreme deprivations, but also moderate deprivations, then you need another set of tools. And so that was basically the task that at hand. How can you look at this challenging question of what is happening to a region like the Arab region that has been through so much, especially since 2010, and how are you able to look at the development indicators from a broader perspective? And so that was what motivated us. The first motivation was to try to give a broader perspective than what was being narrated to us. And the second one, I think, is also equally important, is that it is part of our mandate to contribute to the global debate. I mean, this is one of the most important, I think, issues that we as a regional commission should focus on, in the sense that there is ongoing global debate on how to move beyond GDP as a central measure. That's been one of the major orientations of global development thinking since the 90s. In fact, the Human Development Index was built on the premise that there is a need to move beyond income. And there is a current commission from the Secretary General for the UN agencies to actually come together and think about proposing measures for development progress beyond GDP. So this is part of what we do. Regional commissions have a role to contribute to ongoing global debates, and this is a very important debate on how you measure development. In fact, we're part of the global task force commissioned by the Secretary General on thinking of development measures to go beyond GDP, and this is a way of contributing to this global debate. So that would be my quick reply to your question.
Thank you, Khalid. And it does show the important role that these commissions play in the system and how the particularities, the particular challenges that individual regions face can be a very good basis for a rethinking of our approach to measurement of welfare and development. Let's now dive into the index a little bit and discuss for the audience some of the main challenges in building it, but also how best to interpret it. So I would like to start with a very broad question, but I think would be a question that pretty much everyone is going to ask you, which would be why those dimensions. As we know from the index, you have built it around different subdivisions, starting from the three main areas of challenge, from the quality adjusted human development challenges, which in a sense capture the old Human Development Index, environmental sustainability challenge, and governance challenge. And within each of those, you've got different dimensions and therefore different indicators. So the question, obviously, why those dimensions, and are they all equally important? I mean, you give them the same weight when it comes to each of the areas of challenge. And that's always been a very common debate, when discussing the Human Development Index, do we give the same weight to each of the components? Are they not perhaps redundant? Some people may have asked this question. Is there one of them that is particularly critical in terms of driving the rankings? Why those particular dimensions, and how do you see they play out together when you put them together?
Thanks, Carlos. This is a really fundamental question, and it wasn't an easy task to come to these dimensions. I mean, at the level of the challenge, no one would dispute that environmental sustainability, human development achievements, and health, education, and income, and good governance are key. But then how do you reflect those challenges and dimensions? Has been a subject of a lot of discussion, and more than 30 people took part in discussion over 2.5 years, and many of them global as well as regional experts. It wasn't a sort of a linear task. I mean, we didn't actually start out and say, we're going to achieve this month and then take it in a sequential. It was very often one in which we were surprised by the outcome of our discussions. We initially started, actually, we wanted just to focus on the Human Development Index and then adjust it by quality, because the main task was to look at the quality adjusted human development achievements. And we would take this and correlate it with the other challenges. So you could use a story basically that comes out of a quality adjusted health, education, and income, then say, well, how does this relate to the environmental sustainability, or how does it relate to governance? But over the course of our discussions and debates, we realized that we really should go back to our conceptual frameworks and our normative positions. And our normative positions, in fact, the normative positions of the human development approach, which our work is anchored, and the capability approaches, is that these aspects are an integral part of the definition of development achievements and human development achievements. So this inspired us to think of an index that includes all of these dimensions. So let me tell you what these 7 dimensions are. With regards to the quality adjusted human development, we have health, education, and income. We're all familiar, as you said, with the Human Development Index. And our task here was basically to adjust for quality. So with the health aspect, we look at healthy life expectancy, not just expected years of living or life expectancy at birth. With education, we're looking at the quality of education, which is a tough one, of course, but we relied on the harmonized test scores that are being published, international test scores, to discount education achievements by that. So if a country has 12 years of education, but it performs on average, but it performs poorly on international test scores, then maybe that would discount it to around 8 or 9 years. And obviously, income is the more challenging one. How do you discount income for quality? And after a lot of debate, we realized that the best measure would be to look at whether this income has resulted in poverty eradication or very low poverty. And here, we didn't have a good enough poverty measure. That's another debate. So we decided to use the inequality adjusted income. But again, this is not cast in stone, and this index is definitely not the last word on this. So we can always go back and change these proposals. But those three dimensions were the easiest ones because they're already part of the human development literature and very well acknowledged by everybody. The difficulty was to go into the environmental sustainability and try to think about a story on the dimension level. And here we picked two broad dimensions. One is related to the health of the planet, and here we're looking at climate change and energy efficiency, which really deals with issues of carbon emissions, material footprint, and energy intensity. And of course, that was at the heart of the discussions that took place in COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh last month. And the other aspect or dimension has to do with our health as individuals and how we are infected by these emissions. And here we looked at issues like air quality, sanitation, access to sanitation, drinking water, heavy metals, and waste management. But very importantly, this is the only part of the index where we didn't ascribe equal weights. We took this from the Yale index and we took the exact same weights that were assigned by the Environmental Performance Index. Why? Because when they did that, proposed this environmental health index, they proposed it in relation to its impact on healthy life expectancy. So, in a way, you can argue, Carlos, that we're giving health or the health component more than 1/3 of the DCI index, or around 1/3, because we have this component is also amplifying the healthy life expectancy at birth causal effect. And so then, this climate change versus environmental health nexus gives you the environmental challenge. And moving to the third one, that was a very tough dimension, challenge to split into dimensions. Because you have obviously two schools of thought in terms of good governance. Those who emphasize the importance of democratic governance, issues like rule of law and access to justice, institutional accountability, participation, lack of corruption, human rights. And then there's another school that says, well, government effectiveness, quality of infrastructure and public services provided by the government is also very important. We gave equal weight to both perspectives. So you look at that as we have 50% for democratic governance and 50% of the governance challenge for government effectiveness. Put all of these dimensions together and you get the development challenges index. So, in a way, to go back to your question, yes, we believe that these dimensions are equally important. And that comes from our normative position. And that's how I think we should design indices based on our conceptual positions and our pre analytical standpoints, as Professor Robert Heilbronner from the New School, late professor, who wrote a marvelous seminal piece on this topic and the role of pre-analytical vision in shaping our thoughts. I think that's fundamental points. And thanks for asking this question.
Thank you, Khalid. And very interesting, going into some of the details of the index and particularly some of the challenges faced in discussing weights and how important one particular aspect and dimension is compared to others. Which takes me to, I want to push you a little bit further in relation to questions of measurement validity. This is always an issue with, any index, not this one in particular, with any index, which is when, sometimes we struggle to find the right indicators, to measure what we really want to measure. And I wanted to know from your experience in working with this index, where is it that you found, you've already talked about the questions of around poverty, indices, indicators, as well as governance indicators. But if you were to give some details about particular indicators within the index, which you think require more work, either because the raw data, the raw data that you need to collect to get to that indicator are not sufficiently consistent across countries, across regions, or indicators that are a little bit too proxies, too indirect to what you really want to measure. So can you give us some examples of particular indicators within the index that you think maybe you will need to work a little bit further?
Sure. Yeah. Before I do so, there's something else that's quite important that I need to, and that's basically the theory behind this. I mentioned that there's a conceptual framework, but most of our report results are presented in the form of correlations, and we didn't really tell a story about causality. One can legitimately ask, well, what's your theory in terms of the causality between these dimensions or between these even sub-dimensions or indicators? And that's a very tough question to answer. But we do have a paper, and part of the process of the 2.5 years leading up to the report, which also gets to answer your question. We did 10 background papers. Each one of these dimensions or even sub-dimensions took a background paper in which we dived into peculiarities of that particular indicator, justifying our position. So there was a paper on the relationship between human development and governance, for example. And we wanted to just look at the causal relation. And this is, of course, a very big debate in development. And our position was that it's very hard to say that across time and space that this causal relation would go in one direction, but it's the results would seem to indicate, in our conceptual position would seem to indicate, and in many cases the causality will go from good governance to human development outcomes, and especially if the country is very poor. But in some cases, in some oil rich countries, for example, the causality tends to go the other way. So, again, I just wanted to mention that the report doesn't really get into these causal relations very much, but it's a very fundamental part of how we see the world, of course. And that was a lot of the debates that took place within us as a team were centered on these stories. Now, the two indicators I would say that gave us not headaches, but really a lot of effort in terms of how to deal with them were quality of income, as I said, and how do you discount income. And here we used the Atkinson income inequality measure. But when you come to think about it, it really is a very legitimate question. What does that mean? Because income quality you can even go beyond that to concepts of economic resilience and sustainability, and then look at whether the economy is diversified, or you can also take another perspective on how this income is being spent. Does it go to social security benefits? Does it go to good purposes or not military expenditure and waging wars? Or does it, as we've tried to emphasize, does it lead to poverty reduction? And ideally, you would want to have a globally comparable measure of poverty in order to answer that question. But we didn't have one. The 1.9, or at the time when we were doing this, it was $1.9 a day, was focused on extreme poverty. The $3 a day or $5 a day would be more appropriate for middle income countries. $10 would be appropriate for richer countries. So we settled for the inequality, knowing that we needed to go back and do some work on this one, which we did last year. And there's a paper published by ESCWA with Poe's poverty index that tries to solve this conundrum of how do you measure poverty across countries, taking into account that each country has its own specificities. So you want to keep that comparability, but yet at the same time, you don't want to go into a relative measure. You want to have some kind of comparable but absolute measure. And in the new version of the DCI, we will be using that to discount income. So that's one concrete proposal of how we want to go forward. But then there were many other indicators, especially on the environmental side, in which we wanted to keep the country, but you would have, for example, missing information on carbon emissions or material footprint or energy intensity. In this case, we had to do imputations. And it's never easy to impute when you don't have an indicator. But this was a separate exercise in which we asked, okay, if given everything else we know about this country, can we impute the value of its energy intensity or, for example, its air quality with confidence, with statistical confidence? And we did that for some of the indicators. So that would be two challenges that I would say that we had to deal with. And we were, I think, comfortable enough with the results to produce. But going forward, obviously, the challenge would be to maintain this DCI with all of these indicators, taking into account the frequencies of these indicators are not annual. So some of them are produced every 3 years or 4 years. And that's, of course, a big challenge when you try to broaden the analytical lens and keep 150 or 160 countries in the analysis.
Thank you, Khalid. That was a good answer. Clearly shows how difficult it is to build an index like this with several indicators, some of which are not easy to manage in terms of the available information for a very large number of countries.
We have come to the end of part 1, but please head to part 2, where Professor Carlos and Khalid discuss how these indices are interpreted. Welcome back to part 2 of the SOAS Dev Track series, where Professor Carlos Oya and Khalid Abu Ismail are discussing the UN-ESCWA report on World Development Challenges and how the findings of the report are interpreted.
Now, going to questions of interpretation, what to make of the results of this index. Some people will look at the various indicators and the various subdimensions in the index, and they will pay very detailed attention to some of these different numbers. Some people will just look at the rankings and they will look at the one number that will be summarizing all these different challenges for an individual country. And they will see countries that go up or go down in relation to this index, as it happens with any index. And the challenge there would be how to interpret these movements in the index, given that you have all these multiple subdimensions. So what would be your advice to the users of the index in terms of what would you tell them to do when looking at the rankings, looking at the evolution of the index? For example, some people will be interested in a few countries, not in all countries. They will want to compare between countries. What would be your advice in terms of providing a better, more fair interpretation of those numbers?
Thank you, Carlos, for this question. It's a very important one indeed. My advice is to look at both the scores and the contributions. If a country has an improved score and DCI declines, let's say from zero 0.5 to zero 0.4, which takes it from high level of challenge on our index to a medium level, but the contributions of a particular dimension increase dramatically, let's say that the contribution of the governance index increases, that basically means that you've made significant progress on the other two, but perhaps not as much on governance. So you should always look at both these aspects together, the overall improvement of the score or decline, but also the contributions. And that would be my advice, and not just to look at the score, but also to look at these contributions. And the way that we designed the index and our choice of aggregation method, being a simple arithmetic average, was purposefully to allow for this kind of decomposition so that you can look at the trees and not just the forest, so to speak. So I think that is one way to answer your question. But the other issue is this is a global report, and you also need to be comparing your country with other countries and looking at those countries that were in the same level of challenge. We have a 20-year span, so it's a long-term perspective on development challenges. So it's an interesting question to look at where you were, who were your peers the year 2000, and where they are now compared to your country. That's also another valid question that I think one should look at.
Thank you. Now, let me move on to another different kind of question. It's more about your take on the results of the index, and particularly any findings or any scores that you found striking, you didn't expect, or they were perhaps counterintuitive. Can you give us examples of those, or was everything pretty much within your expectations when you were developing the index?
No, we were actually quite surprised on a number of fronts. I mean, first of all, the sheer fact that at the global level, the contributions of these three challenges were equal, relatively equal, was actually quite surprising. I mean, of course, at the regional level and at the country level, they're different. But that sort of validated our intuition that these issues are equally important. So that was, I guess, the first pleasant surprise, I would say. The biggest surprise to me personally was the fact that not any single region was below our very low threshold for development challenges. So even North America scored 0.249, which is significantly above our zero point 0.2 threshold for the very low level of development challenges. And the implication here is that even for the most advanced and developed regions, income wise, or even on the HDI scale, there's still a lot of work to be done on the DCI when you include issues of governance and environmental sustainability. The other issue, which I thought was interesting, maybe not as surprising, but interesting, was the fact that if you take the global development story of the last 20 years and you take out China, you just exclude China from the story, there's very little progress being made at all. And so this is, I think, one of the things that I thought was consistent with other indices. Of course, we know the significant improvement in income that took place in China over the last 3 decades. But again, the fact that the governance dimension increased from 31 to 35%, and it's the right now, as the report's main key message indicates, it's the most pressing global challenge, I think speaks a lot to this new approach of looking at development from a broader perspective. That was unexpected result. I didn't expect to see governance being at the forefront of development challenges in the way that it resulted. And also to find that the government effectiveness part of the good governance was the main challenge for most developing countries and not democratic governance per se. Of course, these stories are very different from country to another, but that was also. The report is actually full of surprises when you come to think about it. Another surprise was the sheer decline in education in terms of the scores when you adjust for quality, and that no country is at a very low level of challenge worldwide when you look at the quality adjusted education. That was hugely surprising as well. So yeah, there were many surprises of this kind, I have to say, because this is the first time that you're bringing in all of these issues into a single index. But the one related to governance, I would say, was the key message that we found to be quite interesting and really speak to the heart of this report, because it was essentially a report that tried to bring governance at the forefront. And I think our approach was justified by key results.
It's important to find some surprising scores and surprising findings in the sense that it is these kinds of surprises or counterintuitive findings that sometimes make us rethink some of our priors in terms of key dimensions of development that matter. What you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation around causal links between these different dimensions and what are the preconditions of development. So I think the debate over the results of an index of these characteristics clearly opens up even bigger debates about these questions. Now, I have a couple more questions, and the first one relates to the relationship between this new index and other indices. Skeptics might argue, well, this is yet another composite index. We had the Human Development Index, we have the Multidimensional Poverty Index, and the various adjustments that have happened with all these previous indices. Is this new index yet another one, a new one? Is it going to replace particularly the Human Development Index? Or are there strong complementarities between all of these? Development Challenges Index can perfectly coexist with the Human Development Index without creating this sort of crisis of redundancy. What's your view on this?
No, this is an easy question to answer. It wasn't our purpose at all to overtake or replace any of the existing indices. Our main task was to fill a void and try to answer a question, which I started with. If you're telling the development story of a region as diversified as the Arab region, and you're using the current existing toolbox of global indices, would you be able to fill that void and give satisfactory answer from an expert point of view? And the answer was no, we needed to go beyond these indices. But it doesn't mean replace them. As I said, Carlos, the HDI, take the HDI for example. I mean, its focus on basic achievements is very welcome, and there has been many innovations on the HDI since then, on the environmental sustainability part, on quality part. That's continued as an ongoing innovation happening there front as well. But our main aim was to go beyond this measure of extreme or basic human development achievements So think about it this way. Think about it in a sense when you're measuring poverty, let's say. You need to have a measure of extreme poverty, but you also need to have a measure of national, or usually most national poverty lines are based on more moderate definitions of poverty. So a broader perspective here is needed, I think, to be able to give a more holistic assessment of the development challenges. So I think they can coexist, and they should coexist. In fact, the interesting part of this coexisting of both indices and other indices is that you can tell a story of the rank changes. So if you were to use the HDI, this is the story. And then let's bring in the DCI and look at the changes in ranks. Which countries are most affected worldwide when you bring in the DCI? In this case, actually, it turns out to be a lot of the Arab countries are the ones that top the ranks in terms of losses, global losses. So again, justifying why we did this, because many of these oil-rich countries are significantly affected by bringing in the environmental sustainability perspective because of the energy inefficiencies and the high contributions to material footprints. Many other countries are also not performing very well on governance indicators within the region, and many other countries worldwide. So you tend to see a pattern here that there are some groups of countries that are significantly affected when you bring in the DCI relative to the HDI. But interestingly enough, our index doesn't actually correlate. The highest correlation we have with other global indices is not with the Human Development Index, it was with the Social Progress Index. And I was actually surprised to know about this, because that came very late in the process after we almost finished with the report. And I said, okay, now we've done our homework. Let's look at the correlations and see how this correlates with the other indices out there. And we were very surprised to find a very high correlation with the Social Progress Index. But again, that's a different conceptual framework with very different indicators. We hardly have any common indicators, and yet we have a very high correlation. But not all countries would score the same, obviously. So there were, depending on our index, the indicators with rankings would differ very much between us and any of these indicators, including even the SDG index and other global indices. So to answer your question, yes, you expect a correlation, but when you dig deep into the country narratives, they can differ dramatically, as they do, and especially in the case of the HDI.
Thank you. Well, there's some work to do then, therefore, in exploring, digging a little bit in terms of this surprising correlation between the Social Progress Index and the Development Challenges Index, and see in what ways these very different sets of indicators basically converge towards the same picture. That would be really fascinating work to do. Which takes me to my final question, and drawing this fascinating interview to a close, which is about the future of the index and what next in terms of steps that your team and those who will be working on the DCI and Development Challenges report are expecting in the short and then in the medium run. Where do you see these unfolding? What's the plan for the next steps? And where do you see the biggest opportunities in terms of expanding the use of these important index?
The biggest opportunity is to go beyond the averages. That's also the biggest challenge that we're facing right now. So, as you know, when you tell a story of development without looking at groups within countries and how they're affected differently by these challenges, then you're really missing out on the elephant in the room in terms of development progress dynamics, because it's by targeting these groups that you're able to change the development narrative for the country or even for the globe. So our current immediate effort is to look at these dimensions indicators and try to look at the challenges in terms of their inequalities in exposure to these challenges. Are they affecting the gender from a gender perspective? Is there significant equality or other horizontal kinds of inequalities between different groups, or vertical inequalities between the rich and poor? Inequalities, opportunities are often proxied by, for example, wealth inequalities. So all of these inequalities and these challenges, and the three challenges that we face whether it's sustainability, governance, or human development, are now being hopefully captured by a paper that we're producing next month with the tentative title of Development Inequalities Index. And so that will be a very important complement to the DCI. In fact, the way that we thought about this other index was to not to zoom in on these differences that we see, whether vertical inequalities or horizontal inequalities within countries, and then see whether the ranks would change a lot when you move in from the DCI to the development inequalities. And then the other more medium term plan would be to then take this, the whole purpose, as I said, of this exercise, one of the most important ones was to go back to the regional level and, armed with this new perspective, then retell the story of Arab development. And a lot has happened in this region, especially since 2010. The years in which a lot of the instabilities associated with the Arab Spring were started. So it's time to retell the Arab development story almost 14 years after. And so that would be our task. But then the third, more longer term task, I would imagine, would be to partner with other global development institutes in making the DCI a tool for global development analysis and continue on with the global narrative, and maybe every 3 or 4 years would be producing a regular report. But my final answer to your question, Carlos, is that I don't see any reason why the DCI cannot be used at the country level, or why not give this toolbox to countries so that they can design their own stories about development using the 24 indicators that we're posing, or the complementary development inequalities index. So there's a lot of work also that I can see being done at the country level as well. It's a very ambitious project, but we're still thinking about how to take it forward in terms of the steps of implementing this at the country and regional and even global level. So hopefully that will be a journey that will keep us busy for the next few years.
Thank you. And these are very exciting tasks ahead. I do hope that you will manage to work on them and to have the time and the resources, because this is an important project. It's something that, as presented in this interview, has a global outlook, can be useful for individual countries, can be useful for global policymakers, can be very useful for us, academics, researchers, anyone who's teaching, for example, on the measurement of development. It's one of the central questions for our students. I think the answers that you have provided will be extremely useful to navigate not just the report, but also the use and the interpretation of the index, and also really getting to understand the challenges of building complex composite index like this, which is always a difficult task, and not one, as you've said, not one that ends with the final presentation of the report and the index, but it starts a new journey towards improvement, and particularly towards the use and interpretation. So with that, I would like to thank you for giving us your time and your insight into the index in which you worked so hard, and wishing you all the best for the future and very exciting tasks that you've presented here. Thank you very much, Khalid.
We have come to an end of our discussion today, and firstly, we would like to thank Professor Carlos Oya for leading the discussion, and Khalid Abu Ismail for his time to share with us further details of this important report, which highlights the key point of retelling the Arab story of development and how we must go beyond the current indices to understand such a complex region that is diverse. The full report is available at the SOAS DevTrack website, as well as the recording of the report launch event.